Dr. Francesca Delia Espinoza, thank you so much for coming back on the Behavioral Observations podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. We've got a lot of different things to get into. One of the cliches, Francesca, in podcasting is, when you're hosting a show is like, you know, couching an interview as a wide-ranging conversation. I can't tell you, and I'm guilty of using that cliche as much as the next podcaster. But I feel this really is going to be a wide-ranging conversation because we've got a couple of different things to get into. And one of the things I really enjoy about talking with you is that you really go deep on these topics and put a lot of thought into them and engage in a lot of scholarship around them. So excited to get into it. So just for those who, I think it was about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, you were on the show talking about the issue of eye contact. And I want to revisit that because you had sent me a paper that you had published in Perspectives on Behavior Science called Eye Contact: To Teach or Not to Teach. That is not the question. So I want to revisit this because I think, firstly, we have listeners who are joining the program all the time. And so, and I get really, really wonderful emails from folks saying, "Oh, I just found out the podcast." And I'm like going back and, kind of binge listening to them and things like that. It's very, very nice to hear that people do that sort of thing. But at the same time, I realize there's over 300 episodes and that's a lot of content. All of that to say is that for those who may not be familiar with your point of view on this, how about we take a run through this? Because this topic is always coming up in ABA circles, whether it's on Facebook or Reddit or even conferences and things like that. So let's do your take on eye contact. I've got a bunch of follow-up questions, but if you can kind of lay it out, I think that'd be a fun place to start.
So first, thank you for inviting me back to the podcast. I am one of those binge listeners. I do go back actually to earlier episodes because I think there are always sort of nuggets of knowledge from colleagues that I can learn from. But I think I want to start by saying that I attribute the responsibility to that paper to you, Matt.
Uh-oh. What did I do?
Well, it's funny, but it came really about from that early discussion that we had a couple of years ago. What happened after that talk is that I got invited to a few conferences to speak about the topic of eye contact. And then following that, I was asked by Perspectives to participate in this special issue on challenges to the field of applied behavior analysis and to write specifically about eye contact. By then, my thinking around it had pretty much kind of stabilized. I think I had, a good enough conceptual explanation that I could put into writing. But really what, the sort of springboard for all that was that discussion that we had and the challenging question you posed, both, ethically and conceptually. And so I think what came from, the result of that conversation that very much shaped my thinking was around the question, not so much about the question, should we teach eye contact or not? Because I do still think, and my thinking hasn't changed, that that is not the right question. I think before we can answer any question of ethics, we need to be able to define the issue conceptually. And I think that's what behavior analysis does first, is defines the phenomenon, understands the controlling variables, and then whether to apply certain procedures or not, then should be done on a context-specific, case-by-case scenario. So for me, the question was, well, what do we actually mean about teaching eye contact? One, what behaviors are we referring to? What are the contingencies? And what are the contingencies that we're then arranging following that analysis? So in a nutshell, in that paper, I start off, and hence the title of the paper, is that eye contact isn't behavior. And the behavior, in other words, contact with the eyes, as in meeting the gaze of someone else, is the stimulus that results from the behavior moving your gaze to the eyes of another person. And this can be direct gaze, so they look back at you, or it can be that you're looking at someone's gaze, looking at something else. So where the direction of that other person's gaze goes to, and then following, so then moving your eyes in the same direction. So the behavior is eye looking, and I think that's an important distinction, because once we define contact with the eyes as a stimulus, then we understand that it can acquire different functions. It can be acquire reinforcing function, both positive and negative, and a discriminative stimulus function, as in a predictor for following reinforcement. So the question to me wasn't about should we teach eye contact or not, because you can't teach a stimulus. You can only establish behavior towards a stimulus. But whether we should attempt to establish the behavior of eye looking to emerge under the same contingencies under which it emerges in typical social behavior development. And these are social contingencies. So I think once, sort of my aim with that paper was to really kind of put behavior analysts, especially young behavior analysts who may not be able to generate this kind of analysis on their own or without a lot of, mentoring, to go beyond the specific topography, but really understand how it develops and how it shapes social behavior from infancy, and why sort of we need to think about it in those terms rather than a simple objective. It's not a goal that you can take off. It's really the first offer behavior shaped by the social environment that sets the stage for all social learning, social and verbal behavior learning afterwards. And I thought it was important to point these things out before each of us individually, on a case-by-case basis, can answer the question, should I work towards that with this child at this moment in time? And if I don't, what am I giving up?
Mm. So, excuse me. So eye looking. So just to clarify here, so that's is that like the motor movement of orienting the either the head or the I don't know, the ocular muscles? I'm going way out of my scope of understanding of how these like the physiology, but so it's almost like the precision teachers might say that that's like a learning channel of sorts of the oh, I'm going to get yelled at by my precision teacher friends for not being able to come up with the proper learning channel off the top of my head. But anyway, so it's the motor movement and then the result of that motor movement is the actual eye contact happening. So do I have that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's contact. I think if we kind of change the order of the words around, it is contact with the eyes. And
Yes.
once we do that, then we understand it as a consequence of some behavior. But, behavior is movement. So what is the movement? Is, yes, moving your head or your eyes until you meet that stimulus, you contact that stimulus. And it makes sense evolutionarily for that behavior to be one of the first one that can come under environmental control. Human neonates or newborns are born, very much dependent on the actions and movements of others. So from birth, first there's a propensity to orient to social stimuli, and in fact to prefer direct gaze over averted gaze. But neonates have a preference for biological movement over object movement. There are a lot of reflexive behaviors that we see at birth that sort of fade away, such as the palmar grasp or the rooting reflex, kind of, guarantee proximity to caregivers upon which the newborn is completely responsible. But what newborns can't do is they can't really move their limbs, right? or then their physiology isn't sufficiently mature. But the one thing they can do is move their eyes. And so it's movement that reoccurs for a reason. It meets some form of some stimulus that reinforces that behavior. And these stimuli tend to be people's faces.
And so before we return to whether, teaching eye contact, excuse me, teaching eye looking that results in contact with the eyes is good, better, and different. Can w- can you go into a little bit more detail on the, what we're leaving on the table if these repertoires aren't sufficiently developed? In other words, what are the risks of, let's say, there's a behavior analyst and, they're hearing all these things from various communities saying, eye contact, we shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z and yada, yada, yada. What are the potential negative consequences for, just putting that aside and choosing to work on other skills? And again, I want to be kind of, yeah. So anyway, I'll stop over contextualizing the question and just let you answer, and I'll come back with some
So,
perhaps some other thoughts.
so I think it's important to put it a little bit into context. So we have a little 18-month-old that has just received a diagnosis of autism. And we know that in autism, we, we can, through pretty advanced technology, eye tracking, it is possible to sort of track kind of changes in development based on whether a child looks at people's eyes during a social event. So there's a long line of research from Amiclin and Warren Jones. They've published a range of papers to now have I think, sort of a software that again is AI based that will track moment to moment. I don't know if it's 30 frames a second. I mean, something really, really powerful that can detect deviations in whether children look at people's eyes during salient moments of a social event. Social event may be people, doing something together, someone singing a song, and so on and so forth. So we know that children with autism show these deviations from 2 months of age. So, which means that they're looking at people's faces and what people do and say, and their facial expressions less and less and less and less. So they're missing out social learning opportunities hundreds of times a day, week after week. So by the age of 2, they've missed on a plethora of social learning opportunities. And it starts with looking at people's faces, and it starts looking at what people do. So it tells us something about social interest and a sensitivity to social stimuli, which we know is diminished in individuals with autism. But if we take this little 18-month-old, what are we going to do with them? What do we want to do? We're not going to stick them at a table and do discrete trial training. What we want is to change how they're going to learn in the future, and which means changing their developmental trajectory. And it means changing their motivation to engage with others, because we live in a social world. We live in a world made by the movements of people. And if these movements are not salient, they don't hold these both discriminative reinforcing properties, it means that child's learning is going to be more directed towards objects, towards satisfying their own self-reinforcement needs rather than those needs being mediated by interaction with others. And it starts by looking at people. And so if we can change the function that the movement, the product of the movement of people have, that's what social stimuli are, very early on, much of that child's learning, if you can do that really early, so at a time of maximal neural plasticity, then we can really change that trajectory. And, that child may be able to acquire skills that make it less difficult to live and to interact in a world that's full of social nuances, often based on how people react facially to certain things. And so that's why I view it as just the first social behavior that sets the stage of a lot of interactive learning afterwards. It is the first operant social behavior, but very soon a lot of other things come along with it. Showing things to someone because their attention, their gaze on what you're doing is relevant, their reaction is relevant, and how you're going to monitor that, if not by looking at whether they're looking. And for that, you need to be looking at where they're looking.
I see. So, yeah, there's a great quote in the paper, and forgive me, I'm going to read it. So, given what we know about the importance of socially maintained eye looking, choosing to exclude eye contact objectives from early intervention may seriously limit a child's opportunity to contact new learning opportunities within a social environment. Viewed under this lens, establishing social eye looking in early intervention is not only ethical but essential.
Yeah.
And this is the part that I like. This should not be taken to imply that all procedures for establishing eye looking behavior are equivalent or above criticism. Much of the applied research is focused on establishing contact with the eyes through non social reinforcement, such as access to food, videos, or tangible items, et cetera, et cetera. So, anyway, I could go on because it's just wonderfully written. So, can you elaborate on that a little bit? In terms of it's may not necessarily be the outcome, but it's it's how we're getting there. I suppose I don't know if I have that distilled.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a really important point. I think the paper opens with a story about two young children who, and I like stories, as you may have gathered. I think
Yeah,
they're
we'll get to that.
but there's a child who learns to look at people's eyes with the therapist, having food. I chose food, but it could be anything else that is of interest to the child by their eyes, and then gradually fading it, bringing it under instructional control, saying, "Look at me," or the child's name, right? And the child learns to do that. So when the therapist says name, they look up, then an instruction follows, they engage in whatever an imitation trial, and then they receive the putative reinforcer. And I think traditionally that is how it's been taught. The difference between this case and the case that I outline, where eye contact or contact with the eyes happens because it's predictive of social reinforcement, as in engagement in a social routine that the teacher has carefully built in a free operant arrangement, that is with, pausing at the right time and then delivering that just at the right moment. And so the child offers, meaning that it's not under instructional control, looking at the teacher's eyes because they're predictive of the next thing that's going to happen, which is tickles. It's the same topography, right? So if we just looked at it in a single picture, devoid of all the antecedents and the consequence, the learning history would say it's the same behavior. But it isn't. The function is completely different. And and I think that's the important part. I think much of the criticism that we receive, I actually think is well placed. I think when we don't understand the naturally occurring contingencies with behavior, we prompt and we use artificial reinforcers because we're so focused on getting that topography. And then in the naturally occurring situations, it falls apart. And then we are, you know, uh, we're told that we teach robotically, we teach artificially, that things only happen in one environment. And I think these criticisms are entirely well placed. And if you look at the applied literature for establishing eye-looking behavior, they often do not offer a conceptual analysis, which I think is a problem with all applied papers that explain procedures without linking it back to principles, other than just saying differential reinforcement. the question is, what is the naturally occurring stimulus control? Why does this behavior actually develops in the way it does? But also they use artificial reinforcers. And yes, you can fade them, you can thin the schedule, but ultimately you're still not bringing it under the naturally occurring contingencies, both antecedents and consequences. So I think when we're criticized for our methods, I think we should absolutely listen. But I think we need to be careful confounding principles or goals and objectives with procedures. The two things are not the same. And that's why I think understanding childhood development, understanding the specific challenges that individuals with autism face from infancy all the way up to adulthood, regardless of their level of verbal ability, is important. And these things are not necessarily taught to behavior analysts. And I think that's where we begin to struggle because we just see the topography and the behavior, but can't put it in the wider developmental context. And in support of that, I do want to sort of mention a newly published paper by Swedish colleague Dag Stromberg and colleagues that published in a couple of months ago in Behavioral Interventions, specifically on this topic. And it's a really, really lovely paper because they put into practice this framework of eye looking as social behavior. And they show how they shape it with parents without the parent prompting it, with just, using early social play chains, pausing at the right time. And he shows very nicely that we can bring about these natural occurring contingencies, not as a consequence of using artificial. It reinforces extraneous to the interaction, but as part of that interaction. And so I want to mention it because the procedures are well defined and it's a great paper. It involves parents in naturally occurring daily life play activities.
Awesome. I will include that in the show notes. I'll run down that reference and I'll certainly check it out for my own education there. One of the things that also jumped out at me in the paper is that there's some discussion about whether the discussion about reports of eye contact being aversive to particularly to adults with autism self-reporting these sorts of things. And there's a very quick passage in the paper about perhaps establishing eye looking as a reinforcer can mitigate this a negative outcome. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we think of contact with the eyes as a stimulus rather than, something a little bit more undefined, then it makes perfect sense that it can acquire under certain conditions, both positive and negative reinforcement functions. In other words, you engage in behavior to not contact that. And and I completely understand the assertions of some highly verbal autistic individuals who report feeling uncomfortable. And, by no means I would want to, you know, intervene. That would not be my job. I also work with kids. But when I have worked with adults who have come to me either to improve their skills of maintaining a healthy relationship or seeking. I've had, kids have kind of graduated from early intervention and sort of want to learn how to date and or, get a job. They kind of all agree that one of the feedback that they always got was, well, I don't know whether you are paying attention to me, whether you're actually understanding me because you're not looking at me. And my sort of two adults, young adults who I'm thinking of, it was my question was, what do you want to do about it? Is it something that's important that you do? And I agreed that it was important to them to learn to give some signal through, their face that they were paying attention. And so we agreed on what was comfortable for them. And, for one of them, it was, well, I'm okay if I look at their chin. And I'm okay if I look at their, earlobe or, at the rim of their glasses. And so we worked on that as a way. And it wasn't a desensitization program. And I think that's important. It wasn't like I'm trying to alter the function. I'm just trying to find a level where you can provide the signals that are important to maintain those kinds of interactions that will, ameliorate your quality of life and your ability to live in often what must be a confusing world at a level that you feel okay about, that it doesn't. And I think that that's an important distinction between a very young child, whose developmental trajectory is yet to be charted. And if we can change the value of those events that at the very beginning are neutral at best, and that is what the research tells us. The few papers that actually looked at both the physiological measures and behavioral measures, suggest that there isn't active avoidance as such, but these stimuli are kind of neutral. If we can change that, then I think it might change the level of discomfort that's felt later on. You know, if one considers that social interaction is often really difficult and contact with the eyes is often the first link in that chain. So if what follows isn't maintained by positive reinforcement, then it becomes important to avoid it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I wanna just return to something you said just a second ago, just to make sure I'm on the same page with you. So, based on your looking at the literature, eye looking
Right.
early on in development is not aversive, and so there's the opportunity to create eye looking at so in other words, there's no harm that's going to come by, confronting a child with something that's inherently aversive, right? It's a neutral entity at that point. Do I have that right?
Correct. I
Okay.
mean, but also the only evidence we have, and I want to be really clear about this, that, you know, one is we need to define what aversive means in behavior analysis. And I think it's really important that we are precise, because when we use emotive terms to define behavior, especially with young behavior analysts, and our profession is mainly made up of individuals who work with children with autism, at least in the US. And I'm in the UK, so I live in a different country and I practice under completely different conditions, but who may not have experienced or may not have had their verbal behavior yet sufficiently shaped to do an analysis of the conditions under which we use a term. And I struggle when, as professionals, we define behaviors mentalistically or with emotive terms. So we need to define, what does it mean aversive? What does it mean, I don't know, uncomfortable? What is the behavior? Okay. And I think we need to do that before we say, well, I don't teach this because adults who are highly verbal report this. I think we have to be very careful in making those statements. And when we have a little 2-year-old who has autism, for whom this kind of intervention is medically necessary, and what are we basing those statements on? Before we make those decisions to essentially, uh, y- you know, decide not to establish something that is so fundamental to social interaction, that we're very careful. Because actually, all the developmental research, regardless of whether it's behavioral or not, most of it is not behavioral, but there is general consensus among most of the applied sciences that look at intervention in autism, that it is a fundamental skill. And so I think we need to start behaving a little bit more as scientists rather than being susceptible to the sort of social media.
Got it. Amen.
And currently, the two pieces of research that I know of that have actually measured it say something different. The ones in children say that it's mainly neutral. That's Vivanti et al.
Mm.
And there's another one with adults. I think we discussed it a little bit last time, where it was, and I don't remember exactly the results, but there was some idiosyncrasy between sort of a neurotypical population and the individuals with autism. And it was about two people having a conversation and one averting their gaze. And both actually found, if I remember correctly, that, I mean, I don't know if the right word is uncomfortable, but when they were having a conversation, they were speaking, the other person wasn't looking at them. So I think it's on a case by case basis. What is it that that particular person finds, or what is the contingency that maintains the avoidance of looking, the looking away? Is it when someone is looking at them directly? Under which conditions? Is it when they're speaking? Is it when they're listening? Or is it that it's okay to look at people's eyes as long as they're looking at something else? And I think that's on a case by case scenario. And that's why I think we do have a duty as teachers, as people who teach the next generations, to ask those questions. And my students, for example, are banned, and they know if they're listening, they are banned from using certain words. They're banned from using any adjective to define behavior, and they're also banned from using the word is to talk about any of their students. This child is frustrated, this child is aggressive, this child is, they can't say that. They have to specify the behaviors and the conditions under which occurs. And I'll say more, they have to define the conditions under which such behavior doesn't occur. And I think this is something that we are losing because information is so fast now, and it's so easy to be persuaded by big emotive words. And I think we kind of need to go back to our roots as radical behaviorists. It doesn't mean that we ignore emotions; they're just part of the contingency to be analyzed. But it doesn't mean that we should use emotive words to define behavior.
Francesca, I think we could do a whole podcast on, the shaping of the verbal behavior of our supervisees, and I'm restraining myself from going down this rabbit hole for the time being. We'll put a pin in this, and maybe we come back to it later in a subsequent episode. There's so much there that you just said that's really good, but there's so many other cool things I want to get into. So. And one of them is your awesome Substack, which everyone should subscribe to. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Oh.
So this came across my radar. I mean, you've had what is it called? What Darwin taught me? Is that the?
Darwin taught me, yeah.
Yeah.
I have the Italian version and the English version. So the English version is Darwin taught me.
Okay. All right. And so it's on Substack, and you started this storyline with these amazing characters. And the first one I read just blew my mind. One is because I'm an avid fiction reader. Sadly, I read very little nonfiction for pleasure reading, but I can rip through a detective novel in a weekend. That's my kind of guilty pleasure, right? And I'm reading this Substack essay or short story or whatever you want to call it. And Francesca, I'm not trying to, blow smoke here, but it's right up there with some of the really great authors that I read. And I was just like, wow, this is fantastic. And it kind of blew my mind in such a way. It's like opening up a new kind of way to disseminate what we're doing. And I'm actually doing an Inside Java interview tomorrow with Dr. Nate Call on dissemination. And there's this whole idea of boundary encounters and things like that. So this came at like the perfect time. But I'm going to retrace my steps here because I'm getting way ahead of myself. So first of all, for those who don't know, what is Substack, and what made you want to choose Substack as the medium? And I've got some follow-up questions on like why you wanted to do this, et cetera, et cetera. But let's make sure everyone. I don't want to leave any audience members behind. So just try to fill in the blanks here in terms of if someone's listening to this and like, what the hell are they talking about? I have no idea what Substack is.
So Substack is a platform that I think or sort of came about for people to share their writings. So just, some of us just enjoy writing, and it's a nice way of getting your writing out there if you don't have a publishing contract. But it's different from Facebook. It's different clearly from Instagram. It's kind of a community where you can follow different writers, and some of it is paid subscription. So there's some political writers that I follow. There's some fiction writers that may write their own thoughts down and sort of publish them on Substack. So it's really a kind of writing platform. And and I used to write a blog that was called What Darwin Taught Me, about just recording the challenges I experienced as a seasoned behavior analyst, but starting to work with a new species. But blogs are kind of, they're becoming more and more rare. And I had been sort of looking for a writing outlet for a while, and I just came across this one. It just seemed a good fit. I love writing. I do not love academic writing. I actually find it very, very hard. But it's funny, when I was young, up until probably I decided that I was going to be a psychologist because I wanted to be a doctor. That was really the main reason, was I wanted to have this title of doctor. But up until then, between sort of wanting to be a veterinarian and then a psychologist, I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be a journalist and a writer. I come from a family of writers. So my dad used to write scripts. He wrote a couple of political books. My grandfather wrote a lot of books, historical fiction in Italian. And so I've always written, from my diary to little stories for my children to just whatever sort of comes to mind. And I've always written mainly in Italian. But when I came to the UK, I kind of had to learn a completely new style of writing. Italian writing can be, the sentences, sort of, for it to be beautiful to read, the sentences have to be almost lyrical, kind of convoluted and complex, and these long-winded paragraphs. And then I came to the UK, and good English writing is very different. It's very succinct. It's clear. It's precise. And I remember both my PhD supervisor at Bob Remington and Tim Hackenberg, my husband, who is a phenomenal academic writer, used to say to me, both of them actually independent of one another, when you think comma, put a full stop in it. And so I kind of had to relearn how to write, and academic writing is still very much a struggle.
Okay, so hang on, a full stop in English is a period, right?
Sorry, yes.
American English, excuse me, yeah.
Yes. And so I struggled through that. And then I kind of found this style that was kind of, a mixture of sort of my two writing, learning histories. But I sort of thought, well, why not? I write enough. I love narrative kind of writing. I like telling stories. And I thought, oh, maybe I can write conceptual fiction. That's what I call it, where it's fiction, but it allows me to show the power of our analysis through characters, through stories, through clinical cases that I work with, through parents that I see every day. And there's something quite different about between writing a scientific paper where you say behavior is shaped, by the consequences, or, is a function of its consequences, and actually showing that through a story and through the way a character develops or changes. And it's a very different experience. And it's one that kind of I love because it marries both of my passions. One is behavior analysis and the other one is storytelling. I think it's just a different way of getting people to be in touch with our science. I think in a way that a scientific paper can't do.
So the so in the last couple of entries to the Substack, you've undertaken the topic of AI and have wrapped it around or wrapped it in the the story and these wonderful characters, and then the all-knowing, all-seeing, kind of AI brother. And it's fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and you and I have had some email correspondence going back and forth with maybe a little pushback here and there, which has been very stimulating. Uh, and 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 this is obviously coming at the time where any conference you go to, any this just AI is everywhere, right? And so you, can you take a minute and just kind of set the stage for, because like again, there's these wonderful characters, there's there's and they face these kind of conundrums and things like that. So kind of, for the listener, can you just give them a sense of what you're writing about here, and then maybe we can transition to maybe some of your thoughts on AI and behavior analysis in general.
Yes. All right. So, funnily enough, the inspiration for the Aura series, so Aura stands for Applied Behavior Analysis Unified with Responsive AI. It was again your podcast. You were the inspiration for, or your conversations about AI were the inspiration for this. You were running, I think you still are, a series of episodes on AI and the extent to which it can support what applied behavior analysts do. And there was one particular episode where the guest was talking about the development of a system that could sort of, through real-time video analysis, generate both an assessment and eventually sort of program recommendations. I think that's what I took from it. But I remember it was definitely video analysis because I remember going onto their website and kind of seeing a couple of sort of proto demos. And and that's when I started thinking about it. Now, like you, I am an avid science fiction reader. I love the detective stories and thrillers, and but science fiction is really the one thing that I love. And it won't surprise you that my favorite film, the number one film that I would take to a desert island with a DVD player, only watch that for the rest of my life, would be The Matrix. The first
Mm, of course. Well, it goes without saying.
Right. And so it kind of, sort of listen to these conversations kind of inspire me to think about, well, let's imagine a world of sort of, where AI is fully integrated in our practice, and how does it change our behavior, our ability to observe and to think behaviorally in real time. And so that became kind of the seed for the Aura stories. So there are three main characters and one all-knowing AI system, which is Aura. And their characters are Sage, wisdom, Clara for clarity, and Sophia, which is also wisdom, but kind of a younger character. And Clara and Sophia are two, qualified behavior analysts who have grown up in a world entirely driven by AI. In their world, Aura, which stands for ABA Unified with Responsive AI, does everything. It analyzes sessions through video recognition in real time, detects errors, prompts the technicians, generates programs and changes, updates them, writes the reports, produces the technician training videos, and also automatically links each teaching procedure to the relevant published paper that supports it. So it's all evidence-based. But what Clara and Sophia do every morning until the end of their day, sit at their desk, get the or sort of generated output, and then they press enter, accepting most recommendations because Aura is very efficient. And so they themselves feel very efficient. They can follow many cases, many more than they would have otherwise been able to, which means, many more kids can move from diagnosis to early intervention very quickly. Of course, in a country that is somewhat in the future, that has 6G, and this kind of intervention is fully embedded within the health or educational system. And they go, they are sort of, very conscientious, and they become part of this international charitable program that aims, and these kinds of programs exist,
Hmm.
by the way, where, professionals in a particular field go out to countries in which sort of these practices are not yet well developed, and they go and disseminate, and they spend, a summer training people and sort of, putting them in touch with procedures and applications that they wouldn't otherwise have access to improve the lives of young children. And so they leave and they go and spend 6 weeks in another country. And when they arrive, they realize that internet doesn't work, or Sage, the center director, says, we can barely get 3G. These things are not going to work. And so they're there for 6 weeks at this small center that Sage kind of runs with a group of local staff that come from all walks of life. And they realize that they have no behavior to fall back upon, because they've never learned to shape behavior in the way that we still do now. They've never learned to do programming from scratch just by looking at a child and interacting with them and understanding on a moment-to-moment basis what to do right there, what is relevant for that child, what are the goals. They, have never really opened a manual because they don't need to, because Aura tells them exactly where that child is and what programs that child should do. So they go there to teach, to disseminate the practice they love so much, but actually they have no repertoire in the absence of Aura. And so they go into the classroom and they see something that they thought was almost obsolete, people with clipboards and actually sort of, drawing graphs by hand and contacting those changes, that graph that slowly goes up and you're drawing it, and you're not, your behavior is not removed from its product. And they see these teachers who, almost intuitively, but of course it's not intuitive, nothing is, move seamlessly from one objective to the other on a moment-to-moment basis and making these decisions. And they're both in awe, but they're also very lost. And there's this conflict as to, why do we need to experience this struggle for the next 6 weeks of learning something new, something that is going to be hard? We could just go back home and, continue in our sort of, working our lives of efficiency and productivity. And, but, I think the sort of more, the message of the story is that there's something magic about, and I use that word, I sort of, start off by saying we should not use adjectives to define.
Well, this is Substack here. We can break this is fiction.
Right. But there's, the point of it is that there is something extraordinary when you see behavior change, especially in those who are really vulnerable. And you see that behavior change in whatever dimension you're observing, whether it's duration, whether it's latency, whether it's occurrence or kind of frequency. You see that movement, and you know that you're responsible for that change, that, that how you move, how you look, how you use your voice, that your repertoire doesn't reside in a dashboard. It resides in your eyes and your voice and your hands and your posing and your observation and your sort of, listening, and nothing else matters around you, because it's you and that child right there, and you're locked into one another, and you're moving in this dance where you do something and the child responds and you respond in turn. And to see that unfold, I think it's what makes us want to continue to do this job every day. And so they stay. And they learn the hard way. They learned with Sage, who is very harsh. She, has this kind of cutthroat comments. She doesn't lavish people with, positive feedback. She has no time to lose. And, her aim is to build behavior analysts, build their repertoire. And so she does it the way she knows how, through, I'm going to throw you in, and then I'm going to shape your movements one at a time. And so they stay for 6 weeks and they learn and what they can. And then Clara is very tempted, but as the name suggests, clarity for her is really important. She needs to know her path. She needs to know where she's going. She needs to feel productive and efficient. And, she's always been the first in class. She's always the first one who raises her hand to ask questions. And so she decides to go back to a world of certainty and, technology-driven intervention. And Sophia, who was the one who had a few, more reservations about this whole thing, decides to stay. And so the next episode, the next installment, follows these sort of two parallel paths, and where they each meet a new child. Sophia meets it in person. Clara meets it through Aura. And, the decisions they make and how that fundamentally changes sort of their thinking about it. Clara, you know, feels that conflict between, the appeal of automation and the friction that, traditional kind of contingency-based learning brings, and the slowness of it, because it's slow. And Sophia, you know, doesn't feel that conflict yet, because she's immersed now in this bubble that Sage has created because of where she lives, because technology hasn't yet kind of arrived there, of contingency shaped behavior analysis. And
It
so, yeah,
it
these are,
it, uh, it did you ever read Ready Player One?
yes.
It definitely had some Ready Player One vibes to it in terms of like and it's been years since I've read that book, but but it's like technology's like nightmare or fever dream or something like that. Obviously your storyline is not that severe, but it certainly points out some, if this goes, too far, too fast in a direction that is not thoughtful, like what are some of the, it certainly points out some potential problems for sure.
Yeah.
But I couldn't, it's funny. I just thought of Ready Player One when you were reviewing the storyline. And when I first read it, I was like, this is reminding me of something. I can't quite put my finger on it. So it just came to me.
Back to that book.
I'm
Uh,
sorry.
Go back to that book, actually.
Yeah. So it's obviously a cautionary tale of, how things can possibly go wrong. And then comparing that with, the to your point, magic of seeing moment to moment changes of behavior based off of those, therapist child interactions. What I was curious though is maybe we can kind of broaden this out a little bit, so just from your perspective, what obviously this series seems to be a critique of AI and behavior analysis, and or at least the where it could possibly go, but from your perspective, what are some positive use cases that that you could see on the horizon from some of these emerging technologies? I guess my bigger point here, Francesca, is that like AI is not going anywhere. It's here to stay. It's only going to get bigger, and there's a lot of practitioners out there who have to kind of wrestle with this and square the circle, as it were, in terms of how do I leverage these amazing tools that are coming to the marketplace while at the same time not losing that those types of interactions that you so wonderfully described.
Yeah, and you're right. AI is not going anywhere, and aura is not a metaphor. I genuinely believe that is where we're going, and I think there are several companies, not just one, that are so. So aura is not a metaphor, but it's kind of the stories are my way of assuaging my sort of my internal conflict because you know in a way, I'm all of these characters put together. I feel this conflict internally, and the question isn't whether AI is going to transform applied behavior analysis. It will. It has already in many ways, but so far I don't think they're as extreme as the ones I, talk about in the stories. My question is, what happens when it starts to do the thinking for us? That's so the stories are about conflict on one hand, but the other ones are about balance, sort of remembering that every algorithm still begins in one place, which is in the real interaction. And so it's, these conflicts I think are real and they're going to be even sort of more, they're going to become greater as AI becomes more and more sophisticated. And the appeal of productivity and efficiency, is an invincible contingency, to be honest, is sort of maximum. If time, people say time is a construct. I'm not sure. I think time is definitely a commodity. It's if it can save us a lot of time for, doing tasks that would otherwise require hours. Absolutely. They're useful. And I use it. I'm the first to say, I'm not one of those purists that will say, oh, I never use it. I use it every day. I used it today. But you could take it away from me completely, and I can still do my job. I
Right.
can write a report from scratch, and I can still run a program. I can still come up with an objective without ever, I don't use it for that, for example. But things like, this meeting, if I'm having a observation with a child and I am the last 30 minutes, I detail to the team or the parents, sort of, summarize our session, and I do it in, verbally. I will turn on Minutes AI and it will, record, and then it will generate a transcript. And from that, I can integrate it with rough notes, and then I can send it to put it into ChatGPT, and it's being trained to write in a way that I like. And then I'll go over it. And because I've inputted the content, it hasn't generated the content itself. The content is there. Then I think it's an amazing tool. It's an amazing supportive tool. What would take me half an hour now takes me 5 minutes. I don't take very long to write reports because I've written thousands of them in my life. And so I can use it supportively. I can use it to generate pictures of particular, I used to spend £150, about $200 to a Shutterstock subscription every month to generate photos, I don't know, two children running in the park, maybe because I was running a description program where I need multiple exemplars. Every picture has to be different. I don't do that anymore because I can just, I have a bank of pictures now that suit that particular learner's sort of objective where they're at, and I can generate new ones. It can help me generate new scenarios, training scenarios like simulations. I will give them some exemplars and then it'll generate some new ones. If I'm giving a lecture on the difference between positive and negative reinforcement, I have a bank of examples that I've used for years, but I can ask an LLM model, whichever one it is, to generate some new ones based on those parameters. So in that sense, I can use it supportedly because it doesn't take away from my repertoire, because my repertoire is really well established. And tomorrow I could go to my mother's home country, which is Cuba, where, they barely have 3G. They might have 4G now. And I can still get into a room with a child, nothing with me if not my hands and my voice and my eyes and a bunch of toys, and I can teach. Because that repertoire has been shaped through 30 years of practice with good mentors, with coaches, with, feeling the struggle of this is not working. What do I do now? Well, yes, there are 5 papers on this. I've tried all of these procedures. None of them work with this particular learner. So I can't go to the research. I need to come up with something different. Let me go back to the analysis. Let me try this. I can do that because that is part of my learning history. And so in that sense, AI can enhance my work, especially the menial tasks. What it can't do is the reasoning for me. And it truly can, or it can't do good writing for me. I know because I read enough essays from students which sound wonderful. I mean, these sort of beautifully constructed sentences, and they're completely void of meaning. But they don't realize that because it sounds wonderful. And, and I have some students who, write perhaps not as well, but their stuff has meaning. I can tell they've thought about it, they've struggled through a concept, and they've asked those questions, and maybe they don't understand it, but the product you can see is the final link in a problem-solving chain, as opposed to the other ones who have clearly sort of asked the AI to do something for them. So, a good clinician can be an amazing clinician with the support of AI. A clinician with less experience, I worry about, because it sort of sometimes what they might confuse is productivity with knowledge, and those two things don't equate.
Right, like information versus wisdom, type of thing. You could have all the information at your fingertips, but the wisdom of how to make choices in the moment. To your point, your example about going to Cuba are certainly important to keep in mind. Again, we could do a gazillion more podcast episodes on this, and once again, I'm restraining myself from jumping down another rabbit hole. And just personally, Francesca, I've it's like I've enjoyed our correspondence on this certainly, and one of the things I struggle with is that you have 30 years of experience. You're one of these, publicly visible behavior analysts that thousands of practitioners look up to and read your stuff and learn a lot from it and things like that. And, so what you bring to bear is immeasurably different than, you know, uh, uh, than many other folks out there. And so I guess where I struggle with is like, how can AI support, particularly, when you think about, what's the figure people always throw around, like, half the BCBAs today have only been certified in the last 5 years. And listeners, please understand, I'm not saying that just because you're a new BCBA, don't take this the wrong way,
No.
but, I just want to say, but experience, there's something to be said for experience and reps and things along those lines. And I think if I'm taking your point, if you don't get those reps in a certain way, in your career development, you're at risk for falling into some of these challenges that your characters find themselves in.
Yeah, and I think sort of my point is you're right. I have 30 years experience, as many of my dear friends and colleagues have. I think we're also, I think when we started, things were very different. We didn't have access to the amount of, the plethora of information that's available now. There were only 4 manuals that had been published, and so you kind of learn you know, what we might say, sort of, the hard way, as in through trial and error, which I don't recommend. It's not necessarily the best way to learn, but there's something about experiencing that kind of friction, right? It's the struggle. It's the learning sort of mechanism. But and I, the sort of subsequent generations kind of benefited from that. We were able to teach more efficiently, and the sort of complaint. There's a general, you know, older generations kind of there's this kind of generational complaint against innovation, right? Most of us have the when I was little, your parents, we didn't have this, and we learn to do long divisions the hard way, and we were not,
Mm,
and so one might say, well, it's the same as we've all, experienced in the past in terms of this kind of generational complaint about innovation. I think AI is different in that, it's not like the calculator. You still have to do the problem. You still have to solve the problem. The calculator would do the calculations. It's not like the word processor. You still have to generate the writing, or the computer. I think it really is the first time in human history that a machine can replace that, and sometimes does it better. And that's my worry with younger sort of generations of behavior analysts, is that they don't experience that. And those repertoires do take, like you say, repetitions. It's behavior that we're changing in students, is how they see something, how to observe tacting the contingencies in the moment. And I think if, the future generations are trained not in the sort of this way, but through AI methods, where they can just put a paper into ChatGPT, and it regurgitates, a neat little summary, and they never make contact with the primary source, and, struggle through a paper. I still struggle through many papers, but there's something about that process that shapes your problem solving repertoire. And that's my worry, is that because we all need to be more productive, we all need to be more efficient, we need to, make space for more kids, that we're just one click away from generate the program for this child. This is the profile. And, there's a really good paper. There are two things that, when I was thinking about this conversation. One is something that I think Bill Heward said to me a long time ago. Or, well, wasn't really a long time ago, but I can't remember if it was Bill Heward, but it sounds like something Bill Heward would say, because it's just really smart and really down to the point. So I'm going to attribute it to Bill Heward, and please forgive me if he's not the right author. But is technology should make teaching easier, not make poor teaching possible,
mm,
right? And and I think that's sort of the conflict that I'm feeling right now. It is that is, yes, we can. What is it that you said? You said something about the average. I have to think about it, but it'll come back to me. But the other thing that I was thinking about when I was thinking about this conversation is a paper by Skinner that actually Tim reminded me of when we were talking. And it's What is Wrong with Daily Life in the Western World? I don't know if you've read it, but it's from 1986, published in the American Psychologist. And whenever I think I have an original thought, it's generally not an original thought at all. Either Dave Palmer has said it, and or it's been written by Skinner. But in this paper, he talks about how modern cultural practices have eroded the contingencies of reinforcement that once maintained our behavior. And I think this is a similar situation. One of his examples, he calls it the alienation of the work from the product of his behavior. And, he explains that the worker with sort of in the industrial age has become separated from the immediate contingencies of his behavior, consequences that once shaped, let's say, the behavior, for example, of a craftsman. A craftsman can see, touch, and perfect what what they're making. The product of their behavior is also the reinforcer. And and sort of, when I was thinking of the aura stories and automation, that's what Clara is doing. She's, pressing enter all the time, kind of reading and approving, but it's all been generated by aura. And, because her repertoire has been solely, she has no moment to moment shaping behavior repertoire. All she can do is say yes, because she can't question it. And I think we're at the stage where I can still question an output from AI. We can say that is not right because we have that repertoire to do that. And I worry with sort of emerging generations, if they don't develop the repertoire to say that's not right, and they sort of sit at their desk and sort of press enter again and again, approving programs that they didn't create. That's the image that Skinner warns us about, where the sort of the replacement of human engagement with mechanical efficiency, right? I mean, he gives other examples. He gives the example of, the elevator or the lift. We call it the lift, where you press a button, right? And that's what I sort of feel could be happening. So the same cultural process that Skinner described nearly 40 years ago. We risk becoming alienated from the product of our work, from the contingencies that shape our expertise, but also not develop that expertise in the first place in the name of productivity. And Skinner kind of gives us also the answer and the solution. And it lies in restoring the strengthening of these contingencies, in designing these systems that bring people back into contact with the consequences, the effects of their actions. And that's what I believe we have to protect behavior analysis from AI. I don't know whether that's going to be possible. I don't believe the injuries AI itself is losing the craft of the analysis. I think we had one, maybe it was our first podcast where I talk about the craft of
Mm.
behavior. It's sort of reminded me of that. It is that. It is, moving something, touching it, looking at it, change your position. What happens if I do that? And, I was in a conference, and the speaker was, very enthusiastically talking about the advancements of AI in ABA. And it kind of sort of, what he said was that he didn't believe AI would replace BCBA, and nor would kids ever be taught by robots, right? But if the BCBA doesn't learn how to do that in the first place, how to take programming from scratch, from literally nothing, from your own verbal behavior, your own learning history, AI, yes, may generate more hours. So he was very enthusiastic, the speaker, saying, it's going to free BCBAs from sort of the menial admin chores they have to do. The writing the reports is going to free them to have more time to, train people. And that may be true for my generation, for maybe a couple of generations after me. But what about the ones after that? If they've never learned to do it, they can't actually coach someone effectively. If their experience is only in the 1,500 hours of supervision, when you talked about reps, the BACB is very clear. That's the minimum number required, and passing the exam shows that you've achieved minimum competency. It takes years sort of, to get to a point where you feel confident, where you know that you can predict the outcome of your actions on, someone's contingencies. And so that's really my concern, is losing that craft, the slow, the effortful, the interpretive work of seeing behavior change and seeing the product of your actions and knowing that your actions have produced it. And I worry that we're going to become button pushing people, and that will be the end, I think, of behavioral analysis in the true sense of the word.
I see. Well, that's a hopeful note to end on.
I think we can sort of,
No, I kid. Oh man, no, it's important. I think as we're having these conversations about this, it's important to explore, not just the potential benefits, but some of these serious challenges that you've described. So, again, as I said numerous times throughout this conversation, there's many different places we could potentially go, but I do not subscribe to the point of view that time is a construct, and so I've held you way over the time that I've asked you to devote to this conversation. And yeah, so yeah, just another fun interview with you, Francesca. I really appreciate it. I've got a laundry list of references that I'm going to run down and put in the show notes. The Stromberg paper, the Skinner one that you referenced, and things like that. So lots and lots of good stuff. And yeah, I appreciate you coming on the show and kind of you know clarifying the whole concept of eye looking versus eye contact, and having like a really kind of difficult conversation about AI. And I'm joking about the ending on the hopeful note, of course, but I think it's we have to look at these things and consider what all the things that could possibly go wrong, as well as all the things that could possibly benefit from. So to that end, I thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Thank you for having me.